friends, welcome back to Blooming with Ms.B. Today I have a story for you guys. So I actually got a chapter book, Flora and Ulysses, that I want to read together. So we're going to start off by reading the first 6 chapters. Flora and Ulysses, The Illuminated Adventures by Kate DiCamillo, illustrated by K.G. Campbell. In the Tickham kitchen late on a summer afternoon. Happy birthday to you. What's this, Donald? This is your birthday present. It's a Ulysses Super Section, Multi-Terrain 2000X. Happy birthday. It's a vacuum cleaner. It's a Ulysses 2000X. Yep, it's the crown jewel of vacuums. It features an extra long cord so that absolutely no mess, no dirt is ever out of your reach. It's indoor, outdoor, it goes everywhere, it does everything. Goody. You have to try it out. Turn it on. For heaven's sake, Donald. Whoa, hey now. What in the world, Donald? It's semi-terrain. You should try it outside. And that's how it all began. With a vacuum cleaner. Really? Chapter 1, A Natural-Born Cynic. Flora Belle Beckham was in her room at her desk, and she was very busy. She was doing 2 things at once. She was ignoring her mother, and she was also reading a comic book entitled The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. Flora, her mother shouted, what are you doing up there? I'm reading, Flora shouted back. Remember the contract, her mother shouted. Do not forget the contract. At the beginning of the summer, in a moment of weakness, Flora had made the mistake of signing a contract that she would work to turn her face away from the idiotic hijinks of comics towards the bright light of true literature. Those were the exact words of the contract. They were her mother's words. Flora's mother was a writer. She was divorced, and she wrote romance novels. Talk about idiotic hijinks. Flora hated romance novels. In fact, she hated romance. I hate romance, said Flora out loud to herself. She liked the way the words sounded. She imagined them floating above in a comic strip bubble. It was a comforting thing to have words hanging over her head, especially negative words about romance. Flora's mother had often accused Flora of being a natural-born cynic, and Flora suspected that this was true. She was a natural-born cynic who lived in the defiance of contracts. Yep, Flora thought, that's me, and she bent her head and went back to reading about the amazing Incandesto. She was interrupted a few minutes later by a very loud noise. It sounded as a jet plane had landed in the Tickhams' backyard. What the heck, said Flora, and she got up from her desk and looked out the window and saw Mrs. Tickham running around the backyard with a shiny, oversized vacuum cleaner. It looked like she was vacuuming the yard. That can't be, thought Flora. Who vacuums their yard? Actually, it didn't look like Miss Tickham knew what she was doing. It was more like the vacuum cleaner was in charge, and the vacuum cleaner seemed to be out of its mind. Or its engine. Or something. A few bolts shy of a load, said Flora out loud, and then she saw that Miss Tickham and the vacuum cleaner were heading directly for a squirrel. Hey now, said Flora, and she banged on the window. Watch out, she shouted. You're going to vacuum up that squirrel. She said the words, and then had a strange moment of seeing them hanging over her head. You're going to vacuum up that squirrel. There is just no predicting what kind of sentences you might say, thought Flora. For instance, who would ever think you would shout, You're going to vacuum up that squirrel? It didn't make any difference, though, what words she said. Flora was way too far away, and the vacuum cleaner was too loud, and also, clearly, it was bent on destruction. This malfeasance must be stopped, said Flora in a deep and superheroic voice. This malfeasance must be stopped, was what the unassuming janitor Alfred T. Slipper always said before he transformed into the amazing Incandesto and became a towering, crime-fighting pillar of light. Unfortunately, Alfred T. Slipper wasn't present. Where was Incandesto when you needed him? Not that Flora really believed in superheroes, but still. She stood out the window and watched as the squirrel was vacuumed up. Poof! Flop! Holy bagamba, said Flora. Not much goes on in the mind of a squirrel. Huge portions of what is loosely termed the squirrel brain are given over to one thought. Food. The average squirrel cogitation goes something like this. I wonder what there is to eat. This thought is then repeated with small variations. E.g., where's the food? Man, I sure am hungry. Is that a piece of food? And are there more pieces of food? Some 6,000 or 7,000 times a day. All of this is to say that when the squirrels in the Tickhams' backyard got swallowed up by the Ulysses 2000X, there weren't a lot of terribly profound thoughts going on in his head. As the vacuum cleaner roared towards him, he did not, for an instant, think, Here, at last, my fate has come to meet me. He did not think, oh, please give me one more chance and I'll be good. What he thought was, man, I sure am hungry. And then there was a terrible roar, and he was sucked right up off his feet. At that point, there was no thoughts in the squirrel head, not even thoughts of food. Seemingly swallowing a squirrel was a bit much for even the powerful, indomitable, indoor-outdoor Ulysses 2000X. Mrs. Tickham's birthday machine let out an uncertain roar and stuttered to a stop. Mrs. Tickman bent over and looked down at the vacuum cleaner. There was a tail sticking out of it. "For heaven's sake," said Mrs. Tickham. "What's next?" She dropped to her knees and gave the tail a tentative tug. She stood and looked around. "Help," she said. "I think I've killed a squirrel." Flora ran from her room and she ran down the stairs. As she ran, she thought, for a cynic, I'm a surprisingly helpful person. She went out the back door and her mother called to her. She said, "Where are you going, Flora Belle?" Flora didn't answer. She never answered her mother when she called her Flora Belle. Sometimes she didn't answer her mother when she called her Flora either. Flora ran through the tall grass and cleared the fence between her yard and Tickham's in a single bound. "Move out of the way," said Flora, and she gave Mrs. Tickham a shove and grabbed hold of the vacuum cleaner. It was heavy. She picked it up and shook it. Nothing happened. She shook harder, and the squirrel dropped out of the vacuum cleaner and landed with a plop on the grass. He didn't look that great. He was missing a lot of fur. Vacuumed off, Flora assumed. His eyelids fluttered, and his chest rose and fell and rose again, and then it stopped moving altogether. Flora knelt, and she put a finger on the squirrel's chest. At the back of each issue of the Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto, there was a series of bonus comics. One of Flora's favorite bonus comics was entitled Terrible Things That Can Happen to You. As a cynic, Flora found it wise to be prepared. Who knew what horrible, unpredictable things would happen next? Terrible Things That Can Happen to You detailed what action to take if you were inadvertently consumed plastic fruit. This happened more often than you would suppose. Some plastic fruit was extremely realistic looking. How to perform a Heimlich maneuver on your elderly Aunt Edith if she choked on a stringy piece of steak at your all-you-can-eat buffet. What to do if you were wearing a striped shirt and a swarm of locusts descended. Run. Locusts eat stripes. And of course, how to administer everyone's favorite life-saving technique, CPR. Terrible Things Can Happen to You did not, however, detail exactly how someone was supposed to give CPR to a squirrel. "I'll figure it out," said Flora. "What will you figure out?" said Mrs. Tickham. Flora didn't answer her. Instead, she bent down and put her mouth on the squirrel's mouth. It tasted funny. If she were forced to describe it, she would say that it tasted exactly like a squirrel. Fuzzy, damp, slightly nutty. "Have you lost your mind?" said Mrs. Tickham. Flora ignored her. She breathed into the squirrel's mouth and she pushed down on his small chest. She started to count. Something strange had happened to the squirrel's brain. Things had gone black, and then into his black blankness there came a light so beautiful, so bright that the squirrel had to turn away. A voice spoke to him. "What's that?" said the squirrel. The light shone brighter. The voice spoke again. "Okay," said the squirrel. "You bet." He wasn't sure exactly what he was agreeing to, but it didn't matter. He was just so happy. He was floating in a great lake of light, and the voice was singing to him. Oh, it was wonderful. It was the best thing ever. And then there was a loud noise. The squirrel heard another voice, and the voice was counting, and the light receded. "Breathe!" the new voice shouted, and the squirrel obliged. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another, and another, and the squirrel returned. "Well, he's breathing," said Miss Tickham. "Yes," said Flora, "he is," and she felt a swell of pride. The squirrel rolled over onto his stomach, and he raised his head, and his eyes were glazed. "For heaven's sake," said Miss Tickham, "look at him." She chuckled quietly, and she shook her head, and then she laughed out loud. She kept laughing. She laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard she started to shake. Was she having some kind of fit? Flora tried to remember what Terrible Things Can Happen to You advised in the event of a seizure. It had something to do with moving the tongue out of the way or stabilizing it with a stick or something. Flora had saved the squirrel's life. She didn't see any reason she couldn't save Miss Tickham's tongue. The sun sank a little lower in the sky, and Miss Tickham continued to laugh hysterically, and Flora Belle Buckman started looking around at the Tickham's backyard for a stick. Chapter 7, The Soul of a Squirrel. Alright, so we're going to stop there. What do you think of the main character? Who are the main characters? And what do you think is going to happen next? Think about it, talk to your friends and family about it. See you soon with Chapter 7 through 13. Bye, friends!